And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart. And I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late night paper review that won't send you to sleep like the others will. 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. on GB News.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
A very good morning, live from Downing Street. This is 9:30 and you're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, here on GB News. We've got a huge show for you today, leading up, of course, to this autumn statement. The seismic decisions that will be announced shortly by the Chancellor that will affect all of our lives. How will we deal with the heightened taxes and indeed reduced spending? We'll analyse it all here on The Briefing after the headlines.
Good morning, it's just gone 9:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. As you heard from Tom there, the Chancellor will unveil his autumn statement at 11:30 this morning. He's promised to deliver a plan for stability, growth and public services. He's expected to unveil £54 billion in spending cuts and tax rises. Jeremy Hunt will say difficult decisions need to be made in order to tackle the current cost of living crisis. The Chancellor will insist to MPs that his autumn statement will put the UK back on a balanced path to stability as he tackles inflation, which has soared to a 41-year high. Forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility will also be published later today. The Chancellor's been urged not to raise fuel duty in his autumn statement. The RAC's warning if prices go up, it could push inflation even higher. The cost of fuel was cut by 5 pence a litre in March, but the RAC says the average cost of petrol rose by 4 pence last month, with diesel up by 10 pence a litre. The NHS plans to cut long waits for treatment and cancer care by 2025 is at serious risk. That's according to the National Audit Office. It says rising inflation, problems with productivity and delegating hospital work to GPs could mean key aims aren't met. But the government says tackling COVID backlogs is their priority. 1 in 4 employers have seen an increase in staff being off sick compared to last year, according to new research. A new survey found that fewer than 1 in 10 employers had seen a decrease. A rise in flu and COVID cases, as well as the ongoing impact of long COVID, are listed as reasons for the rise. And flooding is causing major disruption on road and rail networks after heavy rain hit large parts of the UK. The Met Office has issued 3 yellow weather warnings, which will remain in place until tomorrow as the country faces what it calls atrocious conditions. Motorists are being urged to stay off the roads. Forecasters warn of flooding in homes and businesses and more disruption to transport services. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with the briefing live from Downing Street.
Well, welcome back to the briefing, and you've just missed a horde of cabinet ministers walking out of the front door of number 10 and on to Parliament. The cabinet meeting this morning clearly over and decisions clearly now signed off by Cabinet. Amongst those walking out was Michael Gove, was Michelle Donnellan, were many of those people sitting round the Cabinet table that will have had to be listening to the tough decisions that the Prime Minister and indeed the Chancellor have been making over the last few weeks. Now, there will be some activity behind me on the street in the next few minutes, which we will keep you abreast of. But before that, let's turn to Liam Halligan. Just as the chairman of the Conservative Party is walking out of the front door to number 10 there. We'll keep you abreast of every activity here on the street. But let's talk now to Liam Halligan, who of course is our economics and business editor. And Liam, first of all, this big fiscal hole that we've all been talking about, what's the scale of it? What are the measures that we're expecting to hear from the Chancellor in just a few moments' time?
Well, we're told the scale of it is upwards of 50 billion, maybe even 60 billion pounds, Tom, over the next few years. But the reality is no one really knows. Forecasts aren't destiny, of course. We'll be talking a lot about forecasts today because unlike that Liz Truss Kwasi Kwarteng mini-budget back in September, there will be forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility today in a bid to shore up confidence and reassure financial markets. But in the end, they are just forecasts. And even though the economists at the OBR, and I know and respect several of them, they do their best to look into the future, we really don't know what the future holds. So the danger is that we end up raising lots of taxes today and denting business confidence and potentially slowing the economy even more in order to fill a fiscal black hole, which turns out to be much smaller than we predicted. And just one example, Tom, which I know has interested you very much over recent weeks, is the cost of that energy price cap. We were told it was going to cost hundreds of billions of pounds, but since then the wholesale price of energy, particularly the wholesale price of gas, has fallen. So the cost of that energy price guarantee for every household in the land and every business up until April turns out to be much less. So there will be lots of talk about fiscal black holes, and of course there will be tax rises today in order to fill those black holes. But viewers and listeners should remain, I wouldn't say sceptical, but mindful of the fact that no one really knows whether or not these forecasts are true. So whatever we're told today, and some of the headlines will be worrying, they will be alarming, while the tax rises may be immediate, they may not last that long, and the spending cuts that we're going to hear about, they may well be in the future too. So this is managing a country's fiscal policy is a journey, it's a process, it's not a point in time. So however alarming the headlines today, people should remember that. Things can change quickly, and in British politics, that's particularly the case.
They can indeed. I suppose what many people will be thinking of is whether or not the fiscal consolidation that the government is now pursuing is the only path that the government could have chosen, or if they could have chosen to do it in a different way. Were these sort of tax rises that we're expecting today the only way to fill this black hole, or could other avenues have been taken?
Economic policy making is always about decisions and choices and striking a balance. And we do seem to have arrived at a media consensus, if you like, that the only way the UK can go now is to raise taxes, even though the tax burden, the share of our total economy taken by tax, is already heading for a 70-year high, back where it was under Clem Attlee's Labour Party in the late 40s and into the early 50s. And yet I would say there is another way. I'm personally concerned as an economist that if we raise taxes too sharply at a time when the economy is obviously stalling, Tom, at a time when business sentiment is low, when consumer confidence is very rocky, when borrowing costs are already going up, and many of us are trying to make ends meet during this cost of living squeeze, if you sharply raise taxes then, not just on households, but on firms as well, with that corporation tax rise that's coming, then you risk slowing the economy even more. And if an economy is stalling and tax rises then drive it deeper into a recession, you're going to have a smaller cake. You're going to end up with less fiscal revenue and an even worse situation in terms of the government's budget. So this is by no means cut and dried. There'll be a lot of chest beating and finger pointing and decisions, talk about tough decisions from the government today. It's quite a difficult one for the Labour Party to get their head around. But I go back to my original point. This may not be the right way. There could be U-turns coming, because if the economy slows further, then those calls for pro-growth policies, for tax cuts to get the economy moving, to grow the cake and solve our fiscal problems, the black hole, so-called, in our budget that way, will only get louder.
And I have to say, it's quite a busy street behind me today, Liam, because as these cabinet ministers have been walking out of number 10, my colleagues in the media have been shouting questions at them. Is austerity coming back is one of those repeated questions. And I have to say, all of these cabinet ministers have been tight-lipped so far. Someone who wasn't tight-lipped a little bit earlier, however, was the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, who was spoken to by GB News Breakfast. And talking about the context of the fiscal statement we're expecting this morning, he went in on business rates.
Business rates will be replaced by a fairer business property tax that gets a better balance between our high streets and outdoor centres, something that keeps pace with how the economy's changed in recent years, and also gets a better balance between the digital economy and the physical economy, because right now a lot of the businesses I speak in local high streets like Wolverhampton, they're really suffering because they've got to pay their business rates whether they're making a profit or not. And they look at the digital world and they see an unfair competitive advantage there. It's really an analogue tax for a digital age. The government itself has been promising to do something about this for years, but they haven't done it. It's time to replace this with something that reflects the way the economy actually works today, rather than the way it maybe operated 30 or 40 years ago.
Pat McFadden speaking there earlier to GB News Breakfast. Well, let's now bring in Jim Pickard from the Financial Times to look forward more to this statement. And Jim, your newspaper has been looking at a lot of the particulars of what might be involved in this pretty gloomy statement we're seeing ahead. What would you say is nailed on as some of those proposals, some of those policies that will be being brought forward from 11:30 this morning?
So what we should expect is £30 billion of spending cuts to public expenditure, and we should expect about £24 billion in tax rises. So to go through the spending cuts, I think it's nailed on that there will be a further reduction in foreign aid. The existing cut to 0.5% of GDP will continue for another 2 years to about 2028. I think in terms of other cuts in expenditure, we're going to see squeezes on most departments. There could be ring fencing to health, for example. But I think across the board, we'll see these cuts. But the interesting thing about them is that for the first couple of years, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will maintain the spending increases of about 2% that they inherited from the previous government. But then they pencil in a real tightening from about 2024 onwards, and basically real terms freeze. But what that is, it's kind of a political trap for Labour, because who knows who will be in power then. It may not be the Conservative Party, and the question then goes to Labour, what would you do? Would you squeeze public expenditure? And if you're not going to do that, are you going to put up taxes instead? So in terms of the tax rises that we're going to see today from Jeremy Hunt in the House of Commons over there, I think we're going to see the existing oil and gas windfall tax is going to be expanded for another 2 years. The rate is going to be increased from 25% to 35%. I think it's going to be extended to electricity producers. And so a windfall tax that the public don't seem to know about, because Liz Truss liked to pretend it didn't exist, will be extended from about £28 billion to over £45 billion. But the biggest increase in tax to think about is very, very complicated. It's all about fiscal drag. They've made it complicated so people don't understand it. But Rishi Sunak last year announced a freeze in income tax thresholds, which by 2026 was already on track to raise 30 billion quid. That is equivalent to a 5p increase in the income tax. Can you imagine if these politicians said if they said openly we're putting 5p on income tax, there would be uproar. But because it's through the back door, people don't really notice. And I think Jeremy Hunt will continue to freeze those thresholds. That will raise another £5 or £10 billion, and he will freeze all sorts of other tax thresholds on things like national insurance, inheritance tax, and the pension tax relief. There'll be an awful lot of fiscal drag we're going to see.
Now, as you've been speaking, Jim, I'm told that Ben Wallace has walked out of the door to number 10. There he is, the Defence Secretary, leaving number 10 now. And Defence is a department that is really looking like it's going to be facing some chops. Gone is the ambition to raise spending on defence to 3% of GDP by the end of the decade. It looks like, other than health, all these other departments, whether it's defence, whether it's sort of all these, I suppose, foreign-focused departments, may well be getting some pretty swinging cuts.
Yeah, and I think the defence establishment is going to be very uneasy if that does happen today. I think that the whole 3% target by 2030 was always one of those slightly tricksy targets where the question is not where we're at in 8 years' time. The question is whether you go up there gradually and have decent increases year by year, or do you restrain defence spending and then suddenly rise up to 2030 at the end of the decade? I mean, that remains to be seen. But, you know, people talk about this as being austerity part 2. I think it is going to feel quite austere. When you look at council budgets, for example, they used to get a central budget from central government in 2010 that was about £41 billion a year. That's already been cut to about £26 billion a year and could be restrained further. What that means in terms of local services, what that means for levelling up, it's basically the opposite of levelling up. It's basically taking money away from town centres, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to see the cap on local authorities putting up council tax, which at the moment is you can't put them up by more than 2.99% without a local referendum. That will be increased to 4.99%. You know, we're looking at social rents. The rents paid by people in social housing will probably go up by about 7% as well. There are so many different squeezes on people that are going to happen in this budget. And I heard what Liam was saying earlier about maybe people will get cold feet about this and think, or maybe we'd be better off doing tax cuts instead. The only problem with that is we saw what happened with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng when they tried to do that. The markets took fright, the yields on gilts went through the roof. That had terrible repercussions for the interest costs on Britain's debts. It also had terrible repercussions for people's mortgages. It just feels a bit like this government is walking along a very narrow, it's a very narrow sort of avenue under massive precipices on either side, and neither route is very easy.
And I suppose one of the big issues here is that this fiscal hole, it's not the deficit of the country, it's a arbitrary, I suppose, target imposed by the Chancellor himself. It's all about getting debt to GDP falling debt falling as a share of our GDP within 5 years' time. He could have set a different goal and perhaps had looser targets, but clearly this is the one that is set, and we're now on this pretty austere course. For now, Jim Pickard, thank you for joining us live from College Green, just outside Parliament there. I'm still here in Downing Street, and I'm delighted to be joined now by Anthony Brown, the Member of Parliament for South Cambridgeshire, someone who has been following very, very closely the economic twists and turns of the country for the last few years. And Anthony Brown, I suppose the first question I'd like to ask you as a Conservative Member of Parliament, as someone who got into power off the back of a manifesto that promised to keep taxes low, that promised an enterprise economy, that promised free markets, is what's the point in voting Conservative if all this government has done is raise the tax burden to historic highs?
Well, I certainly support the ambition to have lower taxes and absolutely to support enterprise and free markets. But we have to recognise we've had absolutely unprecedented events since the 2019 election. I mean, first of all, pandemic, which was, had caused huge economic disruption, was very expensive to give the relief to businesses and individuals. And then secondly, the energy price rise because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And previously, no governments have had to deal with such massive shocks back to back like that. And that's why public spending has gone up and why taxes are going up as well. It's not the government wants to do this. I don't think any Conservative wants to put up taxes. I don't think the Chancellor wants to put up taxes. But the most important thing is actually to reassure to fill the fiscal black hole, to reassure the international economy that Britain is a good country to invest in, and that means having sound finance. And that is what the main objective of the Chancellor is today.
But ultimately, these are political choices being made today. The tens of billions of pounds in tax rises was not the only path that the Chancellor could have chosen. He could have chosen to be more austere on spending in certain areas. One obvious example that has been toyed with by the previous Prime Ministers but has been stuck to now, we assume, is of course that of the issue of the pensions triple lock. The idea that we should raise the level at which we pay pensions to all pensioners by over 10%, as opposed to perhaps means testing it so only the poorest pensioners would get that increase. What's the logic behind spending billions of pounds on a double-digit increase for even pensioners who are millionaires?
So I don't know what the Chancellor's going to announce today. We have to wait another couple of hours to find out. But you're right, it's a choice. I mean, as Liam Halligan was saying earlier, that all budgets are choices. We do have to fill the fiscal black hole, but that can be done in different ways. You can either cut spending more, as you say, or you can cut taxes or raise taxes. And the political decision is what's the balance between those two. And there's no perfect way of doing it. It is ultimately a political decision. And I think most people in Britain would support protecting the NHS, health spending. We know there's huge backlogs on the NHS after the pandemic, and I'm confident the Chancellor will do that, and also protect schools. Very important that education system is still funded. So there are limits. Those are two big budgets. So there are limits to how much you can cut public spending overall. But you're right, there are other choices. You mentioned pensions. I mean, the welfare budget overall is about £250 billion. We'll wait to see what the Chancellor does with that. And maybe there will be some variation on the triple lock that he'll look at. As I say, we've only got a couple of hours to wait to find out. But there was a manifesto commitment on the triple lock, and as somebody who's elected on that manifesto, I'm very keen to stick with as many manifesto commitments and not break them as possible. And the same will be true with the income tax and national insurance and VAT. That was the lock on the taxes, not increasing those main rates of taxes. And again, I'd be surprised if the Chancellor broke that manifesto commitment. But the triple lock.
It does seem that this is a government that is more willing. It just does seem that this is a government that is more willing to break its pledges on tax than its pledges on spend. For example, the manifesto said that the 19% rate of corporation tax was attracting investment. It decried the Labour Party for wanting to raise corporation tax, and then, of course, that's exactly what this government did. Should we be worried that this is a government that seems much more at ease raising taxes than cutting spending?
Well, I don't think it is a government that's at ease with raising taxes. As I said, I'm really sure that the Chancellor and certainly the Prime Minister don't want to raise taxes unless they really don't see any other option that isn't far more damaging. But you mentioned corporation tax. The issue there is that the government had consistently since 2010 cut corporation tax to 19% in the belief that it would encourage more investment by businesses. But actually, what we now know, with the benefit of hindsight, is actually it hasn't really encouraged more investment by business. There's an increasing economic evidence that if you want to use tax cuts to encourage business investments, and I think that's a good idea, then actually you should target the tax relief at business investment. That's a particular tax relief that exists, and make that more generous. We've got the super deduction that was brought in, and then there's other things, the annual investment allowance for businesses that Kwasi Kwarteng increased to £1 million a year, and we'll see whether that will be carried on today. But actually those targeted investments are far better ways of encouraging investment by business. Those targeted tax reliefs are better ways of encouraging investment by business rather than just a generic corporation tax cut, and that is that there's increasing sort of economic consensus that that's the case, and that's why the government changed position, or at least this version of the government, which you've seen as Chancellor and Prime Minister, changed position on corporation tax from what had been the position back in 2010.
Now, originally, this sort of second statement that we were expecting around this time, of course, under Liz Truss, was going to be talking about the long-term or medium-term future of the country. And it was going to focus as well, not just on tax and spend, but on supply-side reform, on the reform that is necessary to raise the growth rate of this country. Has this new government abandoned that programme of supply-side reform, abandoned that sense of a growth agenda?
I really don't think it has. And it's one thing I'll definitely be looking for in the autumn statement today is measures to promote economic growth. I've been quite consistent publicly in saying we need a really laser-like focus on promoting economic growth. A lot of the problems we have as a country is that growth has been sluggish for the last 15 years or so. So earnings haven't increased as fast as they otherwise would, and that means that the government gets less tax and so on. Things would be a lot easier if we had high levels of economic growth. But what we learned from this Truss period is that if you lose the confidence of international markets, then you pay a very, very heavy price. Ultimately, we do have a big national debt. We do depend on these markets for all the national debt that we have. They fund it. If we lose their confidence, then we pay far higher rates of interest. That's expensive for the government. It's expensive for people who are renewing their mortgages. And there was a few weeks there where mortgage rates suddenly went up. And I'm very glad that actually mortgage rates have gone back down to the level they were before. Well,
Anthony Brown, we will be listening out for those hints of supply-side reform. Let's hope that some of that is included today. I'm afraid we've reached the end of the programme, but thank you so much for your thoughts this morning, and indeed to all my other guests as well. Alistair Stewart will be next, presenting our budget special, running you right through what the Prime Minister and then the Chancellor will be saying in the House of Commons. So don't miss that. That's coming after the weather.
Good morning. Alex Deacon here with your latest weather update. A bit of a wet and windy one for much of the country. Do have Met Office yellow warnings in place, but brighter skies across parts of the south where we should see at least a little bit of sunshine. This area of low pressure brought wet and windy weather for many overnight. It's now heading out into the North Sea, but it's going to kind of curve back round and stick around across northern England and Scotland for much of the day. That rain also affecting much of the Midlands and parts of Wales. We do have Met Office warnings in place. Foggy start across parts of Northern Ireland and a cold start here as well, with temperatures below freezing. The rain will edge into the east of Northern Ireland through the day, and it's going to pep up across eastern Scotland with that wind just coming in from the North Sea. It's going to feel pretty grim. 9, 10, 11 at best and feeling colder with some sunny spells in the south. Could get up into the teens. We will see a few blustery showers across Devon and Cornwall through the day, but much of South Wales and southern England should be dry. Elsewhere, we'll keep the outbreaks of rain, perhaps easing over northern England and parts of the Midlands into this evening, but that rain is sticking around in eastern Scotland. So again, Met Office yellow warning in place here. That's in place for most of Friday as well. Perhaps not quite as cold as last night across Northern Ireland, but still with some clearer skies across the south. Temperatures well down into single figures. Well, we've got the cloud and the rain. Temperatures won't really drop too much overnight. It will make for another pretty grey day tomorrow across the eastern Scotland. Again, further pulses of rain could cause some disruption. We may see by the end of Friday more than 100 millimetres of rain on the hills and mountains in eastern Scotland. So as I said, that could cause a bit of disruption. A drier day for northeast England, the Midlands, North Wales with some sunny spells. And again in the south, we might squeak up to 13 Celsius. Just a few showers again for Devon and Cornwall. So plenty going on over the next couple of days. Saturday starts chilly. At the moment, most places look dry and bright, but it will turn wet again from the west. And that rain will last into Saturday night.
Don't miss my brand new GB News show, Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
I think I've seen probably quite enough of Matt Hancock to last me a lifetime.
I'll also be getting to know you better, travelling to find out what you think about the politicians who are fighting for your vote.
They've got to get this country back on track.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m, only on GB News, on TV, radio and online.